April 1945. The rain hasn't stopped for 3 days on the island of Okinawa. Mud swallows the boots of American medics as they move between the canvas tents of a makeshift field hospital. The air smells of iodine, blood, and smoke drifting from the shattered ridges beyond. Inside, the moans of the wounded mingle with the hiss of rain on canvas. On one of the stretchers lie women, not soldiers, not civilians as the Americans first assume. Their uniforms are tattered, their eyes hollow. They are Japanese comfort women, seized with the retreating troops. Some wounded, others weak from infection and exhaustion. They expect cruelty. They expect humiliation. Propaganda had told them the Americans were monsters, beasts who would defile and destroy. But when the surgeons approach, something impossible happens. The doctors kneel beside them, not as conquerors, but as healers. They speak softly, wrap wounds, and offer water. For a long moment, the women don't move. Then one begins to cry, not from pain, but from disbelief. They had entered hell expecting the worst. Instead, they found something they had forgotten existed: mercy. By the spring of 1945, the war in the Pacific had become a slow, grinding descent into devastation. From the beaches of the Philippines to the volcanic ridges of Iwo Jima, Japan's empire was collapsing under the relentless advance of American forces. Each island seized brought the Allies one step closer to the Japanese homeland, and one step deeper into the moral abyss of total war. The Battle of Okinawa was the last and bloodiest of these steps. Civilians were trapped between two armies. Japanese propaganda warned them that surrender meant torture and shame. Many believed it. Entire families hid in caves, some choosing death over capture. Among the Japanese military's hidden ranks were thousands of women, nurses, clerks, and comfort women. The system that produced them had begun years earlier, as Japan's army expanded through Asia. The so-called comfort stations were meant to maintain troop morale and prevent assaults on civilians, but in truth, they became a network of coercion and exploitation. Korean, Chinese, Filipino, and Japanese women were pressed into service, some deceived, others taken by force. When the tide of war turned, these women followed the retreating armies. On Okinawa, many were ordered to serve in field hospitals, tending to the wounded or burying the dead. Supplies were gone. Bandages were torn from the uniforms of the dying. Food came from battlefield scraps. To the Japanese command, surrender was unthinkable. The Bushido Code preached that capture was a stain worse than death. And so, when the Americans landed in April 1945, fear spread faster than the shell fire. Civilians were told that the invaders mutilated prisoners, that no woman would survive their hands. But in the American camps, a different truth was taking shape. Under General Simon Bolivar Buckner, Jr., U.S. forces carried strict orders regarding prisoners of war, especially the wounded. Medical detachments of the 10th Army moved with disciplined efficiency. Every casualty, Allied or Japanese, was to receive aid under the Geneva Convention. Mobile hospitals rose in the ruins. Canvas stretched over bamboo, powered by diesel generators and stocked with plasma and morphine. American nurses and surgeons treated shattered limbs and burned flesh by the thousands. When the first groups of Japanese prisoners arrived, among them wounded comfort women and nurses, the Americans didn't know who they were, only that they were bleeding, terrified, and human. And as triage began, a story unfolded that neither side could have imagined. The field hospital outside Shuri Line was a paradox, a pocket of compassion in a landscape of annihilation. American tents stood between burned trees and shattered pillboxes. Stretchers arrived day and night, carried by Marines caked in mud. Japanese prisoners were brought in under guard, though most were too weak to resist. Among them came a group of women in torn khaki skirts and worn armbands marked with red crosses. The Americans at first mistook them for combat nurses, but when interpreters began to question them, the truth surfaced. They were comfort women, attached to the Japanese Medical Corps as auxiliaries. Many had shrapnel wounds, infected cuts, or burns from collapsing shelters. A few were near death from malaria and starvation. Yet even as the medics prepared plasma and antiseptic, the women flinched from every gesture. Some hid their faces. Others whispered prayers in Japanese. They had been told surrender meant dishonor, that their captors would exploit them. Instead, they watched something entirely foreign. American doctors removed their helmets. They worked quietly without anger, focusing only on the wounds. They washed blood from the women's arms, changed dressings, and offered morphine to ease the pain. One nurse, Lieutenant Ruth Anderson of the U.S. Army Medical Corps, later wrote that the Japanese women seemed unable to believe we would touch them without harm. In her report, she described how one woman kept trying to give us her ring, thinking she must pay for mercy. Behind these small acts of care was a system built on discipline and doctrine. The U.S. Army's medical branch had evolved into one of the most organized humanitarian machines in military history. Every landing force carried mobile surgical units capable of treating hundreds within hours of combat. Supplies came by air or sea: antibiotics, sulfa powder, blood plasma, and gauze. By contrast, Japan's medical logistics were collapsing. Blockades had cut off supplies. Hospitals were overrun. Morphine and quinine were almost impossible to find. Many Japanese medics resorted to traditional poultices or reused instruments without sterilization. For the women captured on Okinawa, this contrast was staggering. The Americans who treated them had more medicine in one tent than the Imperial Army had on the entire island. And the care they received defied everything they had been told about the enemy. The Geneva Convention of 1929, though Japan had not ratified it, guided U.S. conduct. Prisoners, even women labeled as military personnel, were to be treated without distinction. The American doctors followed those orders precisely. As word spread through the camp, fear gave way to stunned silence. The women who had braced for humiliation now faced something they didn't understand: compassion. It was a small story within a vast war, but one that revealed how humanity could survive even in the shadow of total destruction. The faces inside the medical tent told a silent story. For the Japanese women, fear had become instinct. They had been taught that Americans were devils, that surrender meant assault, degradation, and certain death. When they first saw the Red Cross painted on American stretchers, they thought it a cruel deception. But what they witnessed defied every nightmare. The medics who treated them worked with the same gentleness they offered their own men. Hands that had gripped rifles now held scalpels, gauze, and canteens of clean water. Some women wept silently as antiseptic stung their wounds, not from pain but from the shock of being treated as human beings again. One American orderly noted in his journal that they couldn't meet our eyes, as if looking at us might bring punishment. Gradually, mistrust softened into confusion, then gratitude. It was not friendship. The language barrier was too wide, the war too near. But it was the first flicker of dignity they had felt in years. Behind this compassion was more than sentiment. It was strategy. The U.S. Army understood that how prisoners were treated could ripple through the battlefield. Word of humane care often reached the enemy faster than propaganda. When Japanese captives realized Americans followed rules, more were willing to surrender instead of fight to the death. Medical aid became an instrument of psychological warfare, but one grounded in morality. Every saved life, every bandaged wound weakened the myth of American barbarity that Japanese officers had drilled into their troops. By contrast, Japanese military medicine was collapsing under strain. Field hospitals near Shuri were reduced to caves with no light or sanitation. Surgeons operated without anesthetic. Wounded soldiers begged to be shot rather than left to rot. When survivors compared this with the American hospitals, with clean sheets, penicillin, and organized triage, the contrast was impossible to ignore. Even in defeat, the United States projected power through discipline, order, and mercy. To the comfort women, it was more than tactics. It was the first sign that the war might not end only in death. For the American Medical Corps, the Pacific Campaign was not only a war of bullets and bombs, it was a war of bacteria, disease, and trauma. Every wounded soldier, every injured prisoner represented a challenge to science and logistics. By 1945, the U.S. Army's field medicine had become a symbol of modern warfare's precision. Portable sterilizers, plasma transfusion kits, sulfa drugs, and antibiotics moved with the troops. When the Japanese women were brought in, many carried deep infected wounds. Some were near septic shock, something that only a few years earlier meant certain death. But the Americans had penicillin, the miracle drug of the decade. Discovered only a few years prior and mass-produced through the combined effort of U.S. pharmaceutical companies, it saved untold thousands. The Japanese had none. Allied blockades and industrial shortages had left their medical infrastructure paralyzed. To the women lying on those cots watching the clear fluid flow into their veins, it might as well have been sorcery. Within hours, fevers broke. Within days, infection began to fade. The war that had stripped them of control suddenly met a power greater than cruelty. Science, wielded by those they had been taught to fear. In the sterile hum of American tents, compassion was reinforced by technology. It wasn't only that the Americans cared, it was that they could. There is a kind of victory that doesn't appear in casualty charts. It lives in how the victors treat the defeated. For many U.S. medics, treating enemy prisoners was not an act of kindness, and it was duty. They had seen too much suffering to draw moral lines between uniforms. Wounds were wounds. Blood was blood. Lieutenant Ruth Anderson later recalled, "We treated them as patients, not enemies. That's what separated us from the madness around us." To the women, this sense of dignity felt impossible. In their world, the strong did not spare the weak. The Imperial Japanese Army had long taught that mercy was a luxury of fools. Yet here, lying beneath a foreign flag, they saw that mercy could exist alongside strength. The Americans gained nothing tangible by helping them. No strategic advantage, no intelligence. Yet in those quiet moments, they demonstrated something powerful, that civilization could endure even when surrounded by ruin. That realization cut deeper than any wound. It broke the last fragments of propaganda that had sustained Japanese morale. If the enemy could show mercy, what did that mean for everything they had believed? And in that quiet moral victory, the war's meaning shifted, from domination to humanity. June 1945. The Battle of Okinawa had reached its final convulsions. Artillery thundered day and night across the island, shaking the ground like an endless earthquake. Smoke blackened the skies, and the smell of cordite and decay hung heavy over the hills. The American front lines pressed forward toward Shuri Castle, the heart of Japanese resistance. In the chaos, wounded soldiers and civilians alike flooded into field hospitals. Among them, the comfort women and Japanese nurses who had survived the bombardment were now recovering, frail, exhausted, and surrounded by the very men they had been told to fear. In the distance, the Imperial Army collapsed piece by piece. General Mitsuru Ushijima, the Japanese commander, knew the battle was lost. Supplies were gone, communication broken. Suicide charges became the last desperate gesture of defiance. On June 21st, Ushijima performed ritual suicide rather than surrender. His final act marked the symbolic end of Japanese control on Okinawa. That same week inside the American hospital compound, another kind of moment unfolded. Quiet, unnoticed, yet no less defining. A convoy arrived carrying wounded from the front, a mix of American Marines and captured Japanese soldiers. Among them was a young Japanese medic who, despite his injuries, refused treatment. When questioned, he pointed weakly toward one of the women lying nearby, one of the former comfort women. She had tended to him during the final days in the caves, using scraps of cloth as bandages, giving him her water ration. Now she was unconscious, feverish, near death from infection. The American surgeon, Colonel James Holt, made the decision instantly. He ordered both patients into surgery together. For hours, American and Japanese medical personnel worked side by side, fighting to save two people who, only days earlier, had been on opposite sides of a gun barrel. When the woman finally awoke, the first thing she saw was light, white, blinding, sterile, and the faces of American doctors who had saved her life. Beside her, the medic lay breathing, his hand loosely wrapped in hers. For a moment, the war's logic shattered. No propaganda could explain what had just happened. No ideology could frame compassion in terms of victory or defeat. Outside, the battle was ending. Inside the tent, humanity had quietly won its own small triumph. The war in the Pacific still raged, but for those few within that canvas shelter, the boundaries between conqueror and captive had blurred into something far more powerful: understanding. As June gave way to July, the island of Okinawa lay silent, a wasteland of scorched trees, cratered hills, and shattered lives. The American victory had come at an unbearable cost. More than 12,000 U.S. soldiers dead, over 100,000 Japanese soldiers killed, and an estimated 100,000 civilians lost in the inferno. Amid this devastation, The story of the captured women reached the upper ranks of the American command. Field reports detailed how several female auxiliaries had been treated for severe wounds and later identified as comfort women. The tone of those reports was clinical, but between the lines was something remarkable: acknowledgement of shared suffering. In Washington, the Office of War Information quietly circulated summaries of the case. They saw potential propaganda value, proof that the United States abided by the principles of humanity even in total war. But among the medics on the ground there was no thought of politics. They had simply done what conscience demanded. For the women, the turning point came not in one instant but in realization. They began to assist the nurses, folding bandages, carrying trays, translating between Japanese prisoners and American staff. Some even wrote notes of gratitude, careful kanji letters scrawled onto scraps of medical forms. Lieutenant Anderson, the U.S. Army nurse, wrote home that one woman had quietly taken her hand one evening and bowed low, whispering a single word: "Arigato." No language barrier could hide what that meant. In another tent, a chaplain conducted a burial service for both American and Japanese dead. The women stood at a distance, watching as the flag-covered stretchers were lowered into the earth. They had lived through years of fear, indoctrination, and shame, but here, amid their former enemies, they saw something resembling forgiveness. For the Americans, too, it was a revelation. They had fought through Iwo Jima and Tarawa, had seen friends burned alive in foxholes. Many had come to see the Japanese not as men and women, but as symbols of cruelty. Yet in treating their captives, they rediscovered the humanity that war had tried to erase. This moment, fragile, fleeting, stood in stark contrast to the world's next chapter. Within weeks, atomic fire would fall on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The compassion shown in those Okinawan tents would soon be overshadowed by the darkest demonstration of American power. But for those who were there, for the doctors, the nurses, and the women they saved, the memory endured. It became a quiet testament that even in a war defined by annihilation, mercy had found a way to survive. When the guns finally fell silent on Okinawa, the island resembled a graveyard. Entire villages had vanished. Hills were stripped bare. The sea carried the scent of oil, smoke, and decay. For the surviving Japanese women, the nurses and comfort women captured in the closing days, the war did not end with surrender. It ended with silence. They were taken to American prisoner camps for medical observation, where doctors continued to treat infections and malnutrition. But even after recovery, few spoke. Their eyes remained distant, as though they were still trapped somewhere between shame and disbelief. In official records, they appeared only as numbers, female non-combatant detainees, listed without names. Yet for the medics who had treated them, their faces lingered. Some American nurses later described them in memoirs: quiet, polite, frightened, grateful. When Japan formally surrendered on September 2, 1945, aboard the USS Missouri, the global headlines spoke of victory and vengeance. But in the shadow of that triumph, stories like these became footnotes. There was no ceremony for the women who survived. They returned home quietly, many facing ostracism from families who viewed their captivity as dishonor. Others vanished entirely, their names lost to the bureaucracy of defeat. For the American doctors and nurses, the experience left scars of another kind. They had seen the enemy not as propaganda but as people, frail, broken, terrified. That realization clashed with the triumphant mood spreading across the Allied world. How could they celebrate victory when they had stared into the human cost of it? One field surgeon wrote in his journal, "We won, but I'm not sure what we saved." His words were never published, but they captured a sentiment felt by many who had witnessed the Pacific's brutal end. Yet within the machinery of war, even a moment of mercy mattered. The U.S. Army Medical Department cited Okinawa as proof that the Geneva spirit could survive total conflict. Reports of humane treatment toward Japanese prisoners, including women, circulated among Allied units in the Philippines and later in occupied Japan. And so, the quiet actions of a few, doctors, nurses, and orderlies in a muddy tent, rippled far beyond the battlefield. They became a living contradiction to the hatred that war had bred. For the women, it was not redemption but survival. For the Americans, it was not victory but conscience. The battle was over, but the memory of compassion exchanged between enemies and was only beginning to take root. In the months that followed, Okinawa transformed from battlefield to hospital. The U.S. military established rehabilitation centers for prisoners and civilians alike. Among the thousands treated were Japanese women rescued from caves, bunkers, and medical outposts. Most were malnourished, suffering from untreated wounds and haunted by what they had endured. For many of the comfort women, the presence of American doctors was both a torment and a revelation. The fear that had defined their captivity began to erode slowly, replaced not by trust but by cautious recognition. When American nurses washed their wounds, when soldiers offered food instead of threats, a fragile humanity resurfaced. These moments rarely appeared in official reports. The Army's public communique focused on reconstruction, logistics, and victory, but in the quiet margins of war, compassion was still being practiced. A medic from the 96th Infantry Division later recalled, "We had been told to treat every wounded body the same. No flags, no ranks. Just humans in pain." By early 1946, many of the surviving women were repatriated to Japan. The voyage home was somber. The ship sailed through gray Pacific waters, carrying passengers who were no longer soldiers nor captives, but something in between. Witnesses to a moral paradox that few outside the front lines could understand. When they disembarked at Yokohama, Japan was in ruins. Cities lay in ash, families scattered, futures uncertain. The women were met not with welcome but with silence. Society, rebuilding itself under Allied occupation, had little space for those tainted by association with the military's darkest chapters. Many concealed their pasts entirely. Others turned to nursing or charity work, seeking redemption through service. For the Americans who had treated them, the memory of Okinawa endured. In post-war debriefings, medical officers cited the humane handling of Japanese prisoners, including women, as evidence of what they called the moral victory. It was a phrase meant to separate duty from hatred, to remind soldiers that even in war, decency could survive. Historians now view those field hospitals as rare sanctuaries of compassion amid one of humanity's darkest episodes. There were no headlines, no medals, no speeches. But within those tents, a bridge had been built, fragile, fleeting, and profoundly human. Years later, a Japanese nurse who had survived Okinawa wrote in a post-war testimony, "They did not see us as enemies. They saw us as wounded. That was the first time I believed the war was truly over." The world moved on, but those who lived through it never forgot. The war had destroyed empires, but in its ashes it had also revealed what no ideology could erase: the instinct to heal. War strips away the illusions of difference. On Okinawa, amid the ruins of empire and the silence after battle, it revealed something deeper: that compassion could endure even among enemies. For the American doctors and nurses, the war's victory was measured not only in territory gained, but in lives saved. Their duty had transcended nationality. They treated shattered bodies regardless of uniform, proving that mercy could survive in the very places humanity had seemed to die. For the Japanese comfort women who survived, the experience defied everything they had been told. Propaganda had warned them that surrender meant disgrace, that Americans were monsters without honor. Yet in the hands of their captors, they found not cruelty but care. It was a revelation that unsettled them more than pain itself, the realization that the enemy they feared was capable of kindness. The war would move on, to Tokyo, to surrender, to occupation and rebuilding. But for those who passed through those makeshift wards on Okinawa, the memory endured, of bandaged hands, quiet words, and the strange peace that came from being treated as human again. History often remembers the victors and the vanquished, the generals and their battles. Yet sometimes its truest lessons lie elsewhere, in a medic's steady hands, in the whisper of compassion beneath the thunder of war. In the end, what began as an act of conquest became something more enduring, a testament that even in the heart of destruction, the instinct to heal can bridge the deepest divides. Because long after the flags are lowered and the guns fall silent, it is mercy, not victory, that defines the soul of a nation.